Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. Another great crowd today. We've had some great speakers, and Karen's been responsible, as well as some of the other board of directors in our programming group, for bringing some great speakers here. The board met last night, and we couldn't be more pleased with what we're bringing to the public. Thank you very much for coming, and we appreciate your attendance. David J.Firestein is the inaugural Executive Director of the University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center, CPPC, and Clinical Professor at UT's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. As CPPC Chief, Firestein leads UT's institutional engagement with China and oversees innovative interdisciplinary research on China-related domestic and foreign policy topics. Prior to joining UT, Firestein served as Senior Vice President at the Perot Fellow at the East-West Institute. There he led the Institute's work in the areas of U.S.-China relations, East Asian security, and U.S.-Russia relations. A decorated career U.S. diplomat from 1992 to 2010, Firestein specialized primarily in China and U.S.-China relations. He is the author or co-author of 3 books on China, including 2 China-published Chinese-language bestsellers. Firestein speaks Chinese at the near native level. Throughout his career, Firestein has played an active role advancing U.S.-China and U.S.-Asia trade. He also has produced path-breaking thought leadership, scholarship, and Capitol Hill testimony on a range of topics, including U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, U.S.-China infrastructure investment cooperation, and the role of national exceptionalism as a driver of major international conflict today. Firestein was also a principal architect of the U.S.-China High-Level Political Party Leaders Dialogue. Since 2001, Firestein has periodically taught at both the graduate and undergraduate levels, including at the University of Texas during the 2006-2008 academic years. A native of Austin, Firestein holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University and 2 master's degrees from the University of Texas. Please help me welcome David Firestein.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, Ian, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And Karen, thank you. Carl, thank you for your help this morning as well. It's really an honor to be here with all of you on an absolutely gorgeous day here in Colorado Springs. I'm grateful to the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council for inviting me to come speak. It's a real honor to be with all of you. I want to start and sort of set the tone for the discussion with a very profound question that's been on my mind and perhaps on yours as well. And that is, what is the deal with the quarterback situation in Denver? This is something I have been thinking about for a long time, but I now am in the presence of some experts, and I hope to get your thoughts on that and some answers to pressing questions I have. There's a vacancy. Okay. But really, it's a delight to be here. I have a lot of affection for this part of Colorado. My sister lives in the very cosmopolitan megalopolis of Berthoud, between Denver and Loveland. And so, anyway, it's great to be here. Let me say a few words about the University of Texas China Public Policy Center at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. It's really an extraordinary honor for me to be the inaugural executive director of that center. It is a unique place, a new addition to the University of Texas. We just started in August of last year, late August. We've been around about 4 months. And I think the way to put the mission of the China Public Policy Center at UT is to say that what we hope to do is to advance innovative China-related public policy research and action in ways that serve and also leverage the comparative advantages of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, the University of Texas at Austin, Austin as a city and Texas as a state, so that we do things that are different from the very fine work that many others are doing. And for me to have the opportunity to be a part of that effort is something that's a real honor. Let me lay out what I'd like to talk about today. And kind of give you a sense or a map of what I want to discuss. I want to leave plenty of time for your questions The topic matter today is very rich, and I suspect that there'll be a lot of questions and comments, and I'm eager to hear from you and to engage with you on those. I'd like to start by talking about the 19th Party Congress, which concluded in the fall of last year, in October of last year, and it's a very significant and important moment in the Chinese political calendar, and I want to talk about that. I want to talk a little bit about some of the key takeaways from that Congress, because I think to understand where China is today and where China is going, you really have to understand at this moment in time the 19th Party Congress and what came out of that very important convening. After that, I'll say a few words about what that Congress means for U.S.-China relations. And more broadly, sort of where are U.S.-China relations at around the one-year mark of the Trump administration and in the not distant wake of the 19th Party Congress. It's kind of an opportune moment to take stock of this very important and consequential bilateral relationship. And then I'll share a few concluding thoughts. When we break for dinner, I will then do the second part. No, I will try to keep my remarks maybe uncharacteristically brief. So let me just start with the 19th Party Congress. Just a little bit of background on the Congress itself. So just to be clear, because it is maybe a little arcane or difficult to understand for those who are not deeply focused on China. But China has kind of a two-track system. It has the Chinese Communist Party, it has the government of China, and the two things are not the same. The ultimate power in China is the Communist Party of China, and it runs the government and it runs the nation. The party as a party is a very substantial organization. It's an organization of about 90 million people, 90 million people. That's the number of card-carrying members of the Chinese Communist Party. And the party as an entity has its own culture, its own political, its own, if you will, corporate culture, its own charter, and its own convenings and so forth. The Congress that took place in October of 2017 was the Party Congress, not the National People's Congress. So just to make that point. And the Party Congress is an opportunity every 5 years, in years that end either with 2 or that end with 7, and last year was 2017, for the party to come together and the top leaders of the party to think about the next 5 years, to make plans for the next 5 years, to lay out a vision for the party and ultimately for the country, which the party controls and runs, and to have new leadership come in, assign people to new positions, and so on. And that's what occurred in October of 2017. When you think about the Party Congress occurring every 2 years, what it means is that, to put it in kind of U.S. parlance, or parlance that's familiar to us in terms of our political system, you have an initial, a period, a Party Congress that occurs at the beginning of a new administration, and then you have, if I can use kind of the U.S. phrase, a midterm Party Congress that occurs at the 5-year point of what typically is a 10-year leadership period for any cohort of senior-most leaders. The one we just had was a midterm or 5-year mark session. Everyone knows that Xi Jinping is the leader of China. He wears many different hats. He's the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and in that capacity, he convened and was the leader of the Party Congress because he's the top person in the Chinese Communist Party. He's also the chairman of the Central Military Commission. He also, parenthetically, is president of China, but I mentioned that third because that's a less consequential post than his General Secretary position and the others. And in the 2017 convening, he was, if you will, re-elected, re-selected, reappointed, essentially unanimously to be General Secretary for the next 5 years. Certainly no surprise there. His deputy, same thing. And meanwhile, 5 new members of the top-level Politburo Standing Committee were appointed, and that group of 7 individuals, the Politburo Standing Committee, is the group that collectively governs China under the overall leadership of Xi Jinping as General Secretary. So that is a little bit on the background of the 19th Party Congress. Let me say a few words by way of sort of takeaways from the Congress that I think are ultimately what matters most about it, both in terms of understanding China and also understanding what it means for the United States and what the Congress and what China is doing means for U.S.-China relations. So to kind of put a U.S. lens on it. But before that, let me talk about these key takeaways because I think this is an important foundation from which to have the rest of our discussion. So the first thing I would note is, in terms of Xi Jinping personally, the main takeaway point is that his position as the utmost ultimate leader of China was absolutely consolidated with this Congress. He certainly was the top leader of China before, that was well understood. He's even in a stronger political position today as a result of the Congress than he was before the Congress. He went from very strong to supremely strong politically within that system. One of the other ways to think about it is, typically, and by the way, on the Politburo Standing Committee, a number of people that often are reported to have had previous relationships with Xi Jinping, often as subordinates to him in earlier jobs, are also on the Politburo Standing Committee, which means he has a group of people at the top level that are, for the most part, really his people, if we can put it that way. What's also interesting about the composition of the Politburo Standing Committee is that of the group of 7, what you typically see at the so-called midterm 5-year period, or the ones that end in the number 7, like 2017, what you typically see is the appointment of someone to the Politburo Standing Committee that it becomes clear is going to be the anointed successor to the current leader of China. In this particular case, we don't see that. So this is an unusual situation relative to past practice. So to put it in perspective, 10 years ago, in the year 2007, Xi Jinping came into this body, and in 2007 it was widely understood and became increasingly understood that Xi Jinping would become the next leader of China, which he did in the year 2012. A Xi Jinping equivalent on this body is not evident. That is another way of saying that Xi's position, kind of singular level of power, is all the more amplified by the fact that there is not a clear successor. And it's fair to say that overall the consensus about Xi Jinping is he has become the most powerful leader in Chinese history, second perhaps only to Mao Zedong, and arguably Deng Xiaoping, but perhaps even overtaking Deng Xiaoping and being second only to Mao Zedong in terms of the level of personal power politically that he's accumulated. So those are, I think, some of the key takeaways with respect to Xi Jinping. And that's very important because he'll be leading China for at least the next 5 years. Let me say a few words about the Chinese Communist Party itself. This, again, was a party convening. So the party was looking at itself, was introspective, was thinking about its policies, was thinking about the future of China, was laying out a vision, its vision for the future of the country that it governs and rules. And so the notion of party building and commentary about the party's role in Chinese society was obviously very pronounced. Let me just cite a couple of things from the language of Xi Jinping himself, translated into English, that he said about the party, which I think give you a sense for the degree to which the party itself has become codified to be the dominant power in the country, which of course it has always been since 1949. Now that has been codified with some very particular language. Xi Jinping said that the Communist Party of China is the defining feature of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is the political economy model of China in its own words. So the party is the defining feature of China's system. Xi Jinping also said that the party leadership is, quote, the greatest strength of that system. And he also said that the Communist Party is the highest force for political leadership in China. So all of those in some ways are statements of the obvious and what has always been evident and true, but they codify as a matter of party charter and party doctrine that unitary and singularity of Communist Party rule and monopoly on power of the Communist Party. So all of that became very clear and very amplified via this Congress. Let me say a few words about the economy. I won't dwell on this particular topic because, in my judgment, I don't think this particular party Congress, important though it was particularly headline generating when it comes to the topic of the economy. For the most part, what the Congress generated in terms of outcomes and decisions was to stay the course, for the most part, with reform and opening up, growth, developing China, building out the economy, trying to address the income gap, and the various public policy challenges in the economic domain that have long been on the plate of the Chinese leadership. No major departures, I think, that are evident. There weren't specific growth targets laid out, as has sometimes been the case in the past. Historically, from 1978 until the last several years, China has typically grown at an annualized rate of GDP growth of about 10% plus per year, which is something over that period of time, over that length of period of time, that I think is unprecedented in the history of human economic activity. Now, China has, quote, slowed down to about 6.5%. Now remember, China is the second largest economy in the world, and the U.S. would kill for 3% growth. We're the largest economy. China is still doing very well at the 6.5% level. But they didn't talk about those kinds of specific numbers in the Congress per se. There was some discussion about foreign investment, which obviously is an issue that hits close to home for American companies and businesses, farmers, workers, ranchers. And the basic idea was we're going to open the doors wider. We in China are going to open the doors wider to foreign investment. Whether that is borne out to the degree that American businesses would like to see it borne out, I think is an open question. But it is a stated goal of the Chinese leadership to continue this or to build upon the openness that is there. And of course, from a U.S. standpoint and from many other foreign country standpoints, the fact is there have been very significant impediments to market access for many of our most competitive sectors and companies. And so I think the general U.S. corporate view on this is let's see how things play out and let's hope that things continue to develop in a more open direction. So I think in broad terms, those were kind of the themes on the economics. Let me turn to two other pieces of the party Congress that are very important before going to the topic of U.S.-China relations. So let me say a few words about the notion of anti-corruption. I think a lot of people know, if you read the stories about China or if you specialize in China, that China is, and the Chinese Communist Party specifically, it has since 2012 really launched and carried out and continued what it refers to as an anti-corruption campaign in China, focusing on corruption within the Communist Party of China, which in fact has been rampant historically. Now, President Xi Jinping, soon after he became the top leader of China in 2012 and became the president in 2013, made this a signature priority of his administration. And he said something that I had never heard, I don't think any other Chinese leader say, and that was that if we, the party, we, the Communist Party, don't get a handle on corruption, we will no longer be the governing party of China. This is an existential issue to us. It is an issue that could drive us from power, and therefore we need to get a handle on it. That was the essence of his message. He made that same point again in his epic, very significant 3.5-hour speech at the party Congress, where he laid out the vision for the party, the nation, and he said, corruption is the greatest threat to the Communist Party. So he stated that just as recently as October. Now, he also said that the anti-corruption campaign will be, in his words, a crushing tide, unquote, against those who are corrupt within the party. And he said that China has a zero-tolerance policy for corruption. Now, let me just say a few words about corruption, because this was a very important theme in the Party Congress, and it's been a very important political theme in Chinese political culture since 2012. And that is, there has in fact been an unprecedented effort that's visible it's real, and it's visible in terms of specific actions taken to prosecute some very, very senior Chinese Communist Party officials for corruption. I mean, the prosecutions have occurred. People have gone to jail. In a couple of cases, people have died during this process. In one case, someone died before he could be prosecuted. In another case, a very senior Chinese military leader committed suicide while under investigation. But this anti-corruption effort has taken down quite a few Chinese leaders in a way that we have not seen in Chinese history, though at times there have been nominal efforts to combat corruption. So it's very real in that sense. Now, one of the points that I've made to my friends in China, and I've been very candid in sharing my view, is in a one-party state system like China's, where there is only one party, and there are not checks and balances, there is only one source of power, there are no other alternative sources of power, either in the government or in the private sector, in a country where you don't have a free media, in a country where all those things are true, you're never going to make very much headway on the issue of corruption, in my judgment. And I've said that to my friends in China, that it's a great goal, but the inherent problem with the goal is that to weed out corruption in any society, you need multiple alternative sources of power where one can check the other, challenge the other, expose the other, and so on. So what I've said, this is just my analysis, is I think if you have a one-party state as the premise, I think you can probably get at about 5% of the corruption that exists in the system. Full stop. And I think, to the credit of the leadership of China, they're very committed to getting at that 5%. Now, I don't necessarily think they would agree with my characterization about checks and balances, although I feel that strongly. But I think there is a cognizance that ultimately there are going to be limitations to what you can do to weed out corruption in a one-party state. Now, that said, anti-corruption remains a very important force in China politically, and it's one you'll continue to hear about, and it was a significant feature of the Party Congress. Let me turn finally, in terms of the Party Congress, to foreign policy and military policy, military doctrine, because there were some things that are worth noting in that regard, and it segues nicely to talking about the U.S.-China relationship. So, in terms of foreign policy, one of the things that struck me, and I went through the 66-page speech of Xi Jinping, the official Chinese, the official version in English from the Chinese government. They officially translated it. And I looked at that document. And there were actually, I did a word search, there were actually very few references to foreign policy in the document. In fact, I was a little surprised. It was really mostly, I wasn't surprised that it was mostly focused on domestic issues. I was surprised that there was not more on foreign policy. What it did say about foreign policy was pretty much the standard fare, but I want to also flag a couple of interesting tonal or rhetorical shifts that I did perceive and others have perceived as well. The basic idea is unchanged. Chinese foreign policy will be what President Xi called an independent foreign policy of peace. Independent foreign policy of peace. That's a set phrase. That's how China characterizes its policy, and that continues. So there's no real news there. Now, tonally and rhetorically, I think there were a couple of very notable shifts. First of all, overall, I think the level of confidence that we're hearing in the rhetoric and language of the leader of China, now Xi Jinping, is higher than what we've seen in past years. That there is a confidence, there is a sense that China is starting to come into its rightful place in the world as it defines it. And I think that overall tonality of confidence is, in my judgment, perceptible that there's a perceptible increase in that relative to what we've seen in past party congresses and statements. Number two, and I think even more significantly, China is really holding itself up now explicitly as a model, as an alternative model for the world, for those countries in the world who might wish to develop their polities and their economies, their governance, their countries, but who might wish to do it along the lines of a model that is not the US or Western European model. So China is now explicitly saying to the world, if you want to develop, but you don't like what you see in the United States or Western Europe or other democracies, look at us and maybe we can be a model for your development. Now that has been implicit in the past, but I think the fact that China is now explicitly holding itself up as an alternative to the United States, as a model or template for growth, that's very significant, and that came through. And the final thing I would note is, in terms of foreign policy, and I'll say a few words about military, is that the overarching theme in Chinese foreign policy right now is the notion of the China dream, sometimes translated as the Chinese dream. And it's the idea of restoring China's greatness as a nation among nations. And it's the idea of reclaiming that greatness and bringing China back to its rightful place in the world as a major nation, major player, and major force in the world. It's referred to as the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This is what the Chinese call it. That notion of sort of once and future greatness is a very important theme and a mindset in China that came through the Congress and is something I think that's important for us to think about and be aware of. Let me say a few words about the military, and then I'll shift to talk a little bit about U.S.-China relations. As a preface to this, let me make one point, and that is something that may not be well understood in general audiences in the United States unless one focuses on China. And that is that the People's Liberation Army is the army of the Communist Party of China. It is not the army of the People's Republic of China. It is the army of the Communist Party of China. Its allegiance is to the party, not the state. If there were theoretically ever a divergence between the two, which under the present system there can't be, right, because it's a one-party state. But if theoretically there were ever a difference between what the nation wanted and what the party wanted, by charter, the military answers to the party. So that's an important point to understand. That's obviously very, very different from our military. So it's a different system altogether. Now, one of the big themes that came out of the Party Congress was the idea of what was called absolute control by the party of the military. Now that has always been true, but here again, as with earlier language that I mentioned, now it's fully codified and in the party charter and in amendments to the party constitution that state the party controls the military. It makes more explicit and more codified what has always been understood. So that is one thing to be aware of. Now, let me just call your attention to a couple of points, essentially the same point with a couple of different phrases, of some language that came through President Xi Jinping's speech, which itself is kind of a good proxy for the overall output of the Congress, which is why I keep referring to it. President Xi said, "Our military is built to fight and win wars." Our military is built to fight and win wars. Now, those words are very familiar to Americans because U.S. presidents routinely say the same thing, often the very same words. But for anyone looking at China, those words are quite striking because that is not a type of language that we've seen before from Chinese leaders. So the notion that the military its purpose is to fight and win wars rather than just sort of to be there in some theoretical way, it may sound like an obvious point, but in the Chinese concept, in the Chinese context, it's something that's actually quite striking to me. But even more to the point, there was a phrase that Xi Jinping used, and it was widely reported, and understandably, because it is a bit of a departure from what we've heard in the past. And that is that Xi Jinping said the ultimate criterion for measuring the quality and effectiveness of the Chinese military is combat capability. So they're moving from, these are my words, a kind of a theoretical understanding of the military that hasn't been in a major war in many, many years, to the notion of we need to have a military that, if we need to, under certain circumstances, can go out and fight and win. Now, there's nothing wrong with any country saying that we, country A or country B, the US, China, any country in the world, want to raise a military that can be competent and that can fight and win. That's what militaries do. That's what they strive to do. But this is new language, and it's different from what we've heard rhetorically from the Chinese leaders in the past. Let me just make one note before briefly touching on U.S.-China relations and then leaving plenty of time for Q&A. And that is that in the 66 pages of the speech, there was only one sentence that ended in an exclamation point. Only one. I looked through the whole document. The only sentence that ended in an exclamation point happened to also be the largest applause line in the speech as it was given. And the sentence was, and I'm paraphrasing closely, this is Xi Jinping talking. He said, quote, this close paraphrasing, "We will never let anyone take Taiwan away from us." That's what he said, a very close paraphrase. And that was the largest applause line. It was the only sentence in 66 pages that had an exclamation point. So the notion of Taiwan being very central to Chinese thinking, not new, but very emphatic. Let me say a few things about U.S.-China relations. And I'll kind of summarize this a little bit, but we can certainly drill down in Q&A. If you look at where the U.S.-China relationship is today relative to where we were a year ago, recognizing that almost to the day we're at about the one-year mark of the Trump administration's time in office, the overarching point I would make to you is that there has been much more continuity than change in U.S. policy toward China in the last 12 months. In my opinion, no question about it. We could go down the list of topics, but our posture basically, if you take away the rhetoric, if you take away some of the bluster on both sides and strip down to the actual actions and policies that undergird that, there's very little change on U.S. policy toward North Korea or our engagement with China on that issue. There's very little change in our policies, our policy toward the South China Sea, nor is there much change in terms of China's policy. We continue to kind of probe each other's intentions and so on. We can drill down on that. But there's not a lot of change. On the issue of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which is a very big issue in the relationship, no big change. This president, like past presidents, authorized an arms sales package comparable to what we've seen in the past. Trade, the deficit is very close to what it was the year before before President Trump became president. No immediate discernible changes there. Some tough rhetoric. The reality of the policy, pretty similar. And on the issue of human rights, I would say that the Trump administration, at least in this last 12 months, hasn't changed the U.S. approach to China on human rights dramatically, in my estimation. Some might disagree with that, but the point that I'm making is the issue was not, in my judgment, particularly pronounced under the Obama administration, and it's not particularly pronounced from a U.S. standpoint under this administration. Whether it should be is very much a legitimate, debatable topic, and many Americans believe it ought to have much more prominence than it has in recent administrations. But the point is there's not much of a change in my judgment there. It's pretty downplayed at this time. Now, let me just say one thing about what I think could be a possible nexus between the Party Congress and one other element of U.S.-China relations, and that's the issue of the narrative in this country about China. And I perceive, and this is not a matter of fact, but a perception and an assessment, that it is possible that the confidence that we saw coming out of the Party Congress in October, when it ended, has fueled perhaps a higher temperature on rhetoric about China and language and narrative about China in this country, in the media, in academia, and across society, but particularly in the media. And I think we've seen in recent weeks a spate of articles, a lot of articles in this country, as well as a congressional hearing, at least one, that has really started to take a serious look at China and what its intentions are toward the United States. And there's been a particular focus about China's, what many refer to as China's, quote, influence operations in the United States. This has become a theme that's become quite prevalent in China-related reporting in the media. Now, I want to make just one quick point about this. For years, I have taken the view, and I've talked about this publicly over the last several years and privately, that from an American standpoint, from my standpoint as an American, I am concerned about the reflexive negativity in the framing of China in this country. And I see some heads nodding as well. I know Sky and I talked a little bit about this earlier. And I think it is a problem, not for the Chinese. It's a problem for us, in my opinion. And I'll tell you why I think that. First of all, this reflexive negativity about China that sort of posits that everything China does by definition must be inimical to the interests of our country, must be antithetical to our interests, must be against us. That framing creates a self-perpetuating vicious cycle that becomes very difficult to get out of. Now, in fact, on some issues, China's interests and our interests are very different. And in some ways, China is very, very much competing with the United States. And I've said before, and I'll say again, I think China is unquestionably the most formidable overall national competitor to the United States that there is. And that will be true for the lifetimes of everyone in this room. Literally, 80, 100 years. That being said, it's also true that there are many areas where we can cooperate with China, and we have to, not out of altruism, not for China's sake, but for ours. And we sometimes lose those opportunities when we get into a reflexive negative mindset about China that causes us sometimes not to see the opportunities for where they are. So a vicious cycle of negative perceptions which can feed on itself and generate greater levels of confrontation and adversarial framing in ways that undermine our national interests. That's a concern. Missed opportunities, both diplomatically and certainly for U.S. business. That's not only a concern of mine, that's a massive concern of the business community who doesn't want to see this kind, generally speaking, this kind of negative narrative or reflexively negative narrative. Sometimes the negative narrative can get in the way of actually reporting facts, so that, in fact, fiction is reported rather than fact simply because it fits the narrative. And that is problematic given this country's great tradition of journalism. And we sometimes, I think, fall short because we want something to fit into a predefined narrative that, in some cases, maybe shouldn't fit. One of the big concerns I have about this reflexive negativity, reflexive negative narrative, is the fact that it bespeaks and suggests a sense of weakness in our country. It suggests that we feel weak. It suggests that we feel a lack of confidence. It suggests that we are worried as to whether we can compete with the Chinese. It suggests fear. And my concern as an American, and the reason why I think a negative narrative about China in America is bad for America, is because I think that can embolden America's competitors and actually undermine U.S. interests. One good example of this kind of a mindset came through the Congressional Executive Committee on China, CECC, in its hearing on December 13th called The Long Arm of China, Exporting Authoritarianism with Chinese Characteristics, which looked at China's, quote, influence operations in the United States. By the way, another word for influence operations is public diplomacy, which is the effort to understand, inform, and influence foreign public opinion in support of your country's foreign policy objectives. And if you take a look at that hearing, and it's online, you can see the 2-hour video, you almost get a palpable sense of fear coming from the Americans. I think that's unbecoming. I think we're a strong nation and we should convey a sense of strength. So anyway, because of that type of signaling, the signaling of a sense of weakness or lack of confidence, that can embolden others. The last couple of points I would make on this is two things. And I know we have some students in the room here, and the last point speaks to the students. But the second to last point is the issue of reciprocity. If we start to hunker down as a country and say we're not going to engage the Chinese, we're not going to accept their support for different kinds of exchanges and so forth and so on, then what in the world do we expect the Chinese are going to do when it comes to the Fulbright program, or the Humphrey program, or the International Visitors Leadership Program, or the myriad U.S. government-funded and sponsored exchanges, which I think are a hallmark of our public diplomacy and a great treasure for our nation. Many of you have been involved in Fulbright and other exchanges. These are enormously valuable opportunities. Well, they're funded by the U.S. government. If China adopts the same mindset that we're starting to see in media narratives here, then we can kiss those programs goodbye and the exchanges that are generated, the exchanges of ideas, the increased understanding. And if someone were to ever say we're not going to take money from the Fulbright program because it's an American program, we in the United States would, in the U.S. government, would feel very upset about that. But we're starting to see in media narratives here a desire to really hunker down and move away from engagement with China. To me, that's concerning because it can have a negative impact on our own public diplomacy efforts, which we actively engage in the world. The final thing I want to say goes to the students. If we have a reflexively negative mindset about China, and let me just be also very clear, there's no question that there are things that China does that are antithetical to U.S. interests. Nobody's disputing that. There are also things that China does and can do that can be in alignment with our interests. And what I'm talking about is the need for a nuanced and textured narrative rather than a reflexively or ideologically driven negative narrative. Now, if you have a reflexive negative narrative and that becomes the national language on China, then what does that mean for the next generation of American stewards of the U.S.-China relationship? What signal does it send to them? What is inculcated in their thinking about this absolutely consequential bilateral relationship? I've said that the U.S.-China bilateral relationship is not only the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, it's the most consequential bilateral relationship in the history of the world. And it will be for the lifetimes of everyone in this room and beyond. And we need to be nuanced, textured, and clear-eyed, not reflexive, and not ideological in how we deal with China. These are the reasons why I think a negative narrative in this country about China is bad for America. Forget China. That's not my concern. It's bad for America for the reasons that I've laid out. By the way, let's also be very honest. There are oftentimes very, very negative framings and narratives about the United States in China. The difference is, of course, the Chinese media context is an absolutely unlevel playing field controlled by the Communist Party, absolutely, on matters that matter most, and overall, but particularly on matters and content that matter most. And there's no question that there's a negative framing there that oftentimes is the policy of the Communist Party that runs the media. That's a different story, and we can talk a lot about that. But what I wanted to focus on was the media narrative in this country. So I'll just say this, and then I'll conclude. I've said to Chinese friends, and I've said to American friends, and I've said it publicly and I've said it privately, that we need to fix the narrative in this country about China because it's a good thing for us to do as a nation. It's good for us. And it will allow us to see the opportunities where they are, to see the threats and challenges where they are, and to capitalize on the former and neutralize as best we can the latter. And we have to be clear-eyed about it, And I also believe that a big part of changing that narrative is bringing Heartland America to the table in engaging with China to a greater degree. Because ultimately, what Heartland America cares about is mutual prosperity, jobs, investment, opportunities, education, cultural exchanges. And those issues are important, and I think we can't neglect the heartland of the United States in a very broad sense, the area between the coasts and between the Great Lakes and the Gulf, and that's a rich opportunity for us. Let me conclude by saying that the Party Congress, I think, was a consequential moment for China. It's a moment that we in the United States need to take stock of and note. We, too, are in an interesting moment politically in this country, a year into the administration of President Trump. I think we have probably some part of this year as a bilateral partnership to do things that can help change the narrative and work together to actually do things that benefit our two peoples before the midterm elections kick in earnest. And of course, days after the midterm election, 2020 begins and we go after this all over again. I would just note one last point. I don't know that I've ever seen an atmosphere or climate in terms of the U.S. narrative on China as negative as I see right now, given that unemployment is at an all-time low, 401ks are at an all-time high, the economy is doing great, the stock markets are at record levels. By a lot of indicators, a good swath of America is doing well. Not everyone, but a good swath. Relative to recent years, performance is high. And we're not in the midst of a presidential campaign, and we're not yet deeply into the fall midterms. Given that we're not in the fall midterms and that we have great economic growth, this is a pretty startling level of anti-China sentiment that I see in this country. That's concerning to me, because I think a good relationship with China is good for America. So, with that, it's been my honor to be with you, and I am grateful for the generous gift of your time, and really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Karen just has passed me the microphone, so I'll get to wander around. But I'm going to take the privilege of the first question, because one of your last comments was about getting the heartland of America to China. And of course, our ambassador to Beijing, Terry Branstad, former governor of Iowa, and
absolutely,
he had hosted Xi Jinping, as people know, hosted Xi Jinping 1,000 years ago in Des Moines. But what influence, what role is he playing? Or do you have a sense of the role that he's playing in shaping policy, or is he just a very effective buffer for Washington in Beijing?
Well, it's a great question, and let me just be very honest about it. I used to be with the U.S. government. I was a U.S. Foreign Service officer for 18 years. I no longer am. I've been out of the government for about 8 years, so I don't claim to have any inside insights about that. But my perception is that Ambassador Branstad is a very serious public servant. Obviously, he was a long-serving governor of the great state of Iowa. He understands U.S. agriculture better than almost anyone. I think he understands the critical importance of trade and the critical importance of keeping markets open and getting them to open up further in cases where they're not so open. And I get the sense from a distance, again, not speaking from any inside insights or knowledge, that he is an effective and important advocate within the administration in a senior position for engaging with China overall and for understanding the needs and concerns of U.S. business, farmers, ranchers, workers, and advocating for those needs as we engage with China. So I think his role, my guess is quite important and significant. And I will also say that given the, let's say, unconventional rhetorical style of the current incumbent of the Oval Office, he has a very important and sensitive role for explaining to China in terms that Chinese can understand what the President of the United States sees as a vision for the U.S.-China relationship, and helping make sure that the communication between the United States and the Chinese leadership is effective and doesn't generate misunderstandings or misperceptions. I don't think that's an easy task, and I sense that Ambassador Brenstead is well placed to perform that task.
I agree. Question right here. Two questions, one right after the other.
With both China and Russia striving to reclaim their place in the world, can you speak to that relationship and that interaction and how it impacts us?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And let me just say, when I was at the East-West Institute, my previous job, I was the senior vice president responsible for China and Russia. Let me just also say as an aside, at one point in my career at the East-West Institute, my job portfolio was China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And I once gave a talk updating current events in the four places, and my joking working title of the talk was, "Move along, folks, nothing to see here, nothing to see here." But it was a very interesting job. On the substance of your question about Russia, and I lived and worked in Russia as well as a U.S. diplomat as I did in China, the China-Russia relationship has evolved and developed in recent years in somewhat significant ways. China-Russia trade used to be absolutely anemic. It has increased significantly in the last 5 or 10 years, like doubled and more than doubled. It's nothing like what the U.S.-China trade relationship is, but it's very significant growth relative to what the baseline was. Geopolitically, I think China and Russia often, but not always, see the world through a fairly similar lens. And in very broad terms, I think both of those countries tend to see the world as an aspiring great power that wants to be one of the co-equal poles of a multipolar world, and that doesn't necessarily want to see the United States continue in its role as sole superpower for indefinitely. So I think just philosophically and sort of geophilosophically, if I can coin that phrase, they're coming at things broadly in the same way. They tend to vote together in the United Nations on most but not all issues and so on. However, what I will also say is I think there is an upper limit to where the China-Russia relationship can go for a variety of reasons. And the way that I would say it, and I've talked about this before in different venues, but the way that I would say it here simply is that in my judgment, speaking about Russia, and this goes to the question here, I think Russia's central problem psychically as a nation among nations is the vector, the gap between how it sees itself and what its actual capabilities are. And there is a cognitive dissonance between its own image of itself and what it actually can do in the world today. Now, a corollary of that is the fact that in my personal estimation, this is just my opinion, I feel pretty confident about the accuracy of it. I believe Russia thinks that the only country in the world that has the standing to sit down across from Russia as an equal is the United States. Now, notice that I didn't say China. So I think fundamentally Russia doesn't view China as a geopolitical equal, notwithstanding the fact that China is in fact the second largest economy, has way overtaken Russia and will continue to go even far beyond that. And by other metrics, there are any number of ways you can say that China has outpaced Russia, particularly in the economic sphere. But Russia, I just don't think, sees anyone in the world as its natural counterpart other than the United States. And I think there are various reasons for that. And because of that, and that's a simple way, there are other things I could say, that's a simple way from a Russian standpoint of saying I don't think that relationship is ever going to become, quote, an alliance or a close bond that would be threatening to the United States per se, because they themselves have disagreements and some deep history there that precludes that. From a Chinese vantage point, if I can sort of make a similar point, I think they think their opposite number in the world is the United States. And they don't think of Russia like they did in the 1950s or 60s. So I think there is a kind of glass ceiling to what the China-Russia relationship can develop into. And that's why, as an American and former U.S. diplomat, et cetera, I don't worry a lot about the notion of a grand China-Russia, quote, axis or alliance that would work in ways detrimental to our interests.
A question here, and then I'm going to move in that direction and hope we can get a student question.
非常谢你讲很有意思，谢谢你。
谢谢，谢谢。
The book written by Australian scholar Hugh White, China Choice, documents and builds the case that there are probably more opportunities for China-U.S. relations to deteriorate to the point of serious consideration of even war. And a reasonable way to try to sidetrack that would be to consciously, China and the U.S. consciously share power in that part of the world. Would you care to comment on that, please?
In Asia, you mean?
Yes, in Asia.
My overall assessment of the U.S.-China strategic relationship is that there are a number of areas where we simply don't see eye to eye, no question about it. There are a number of areas where China, from a U.S. standpoint, is working in ways that are antithetical to our interests. And from a Chinese standpoint, where we are working in ways that are very antithetical to their interests. I don't think any of those problems, for the most part, are going to go away. So we have to live with the complexity of a relationship where we know we're not going to see eye to eye on some very basic things. And at a systemic level, with China being, according to its own Article 1 of its own constitution, a people's democratic dictatorship. So according to China itself, China refers to itself as a dictatorship, a people's democratic dictatorship. We have a very different political system, et cetera. There's some fundamental areas where we simply are not going to see eye to eye. My view is we need to live with that and work on the areas where we can and build out a relationship that's mutually beneficial and advance our interests in ways that are additive and not unduly adversarial. I think the U.S. will, my sense is that even in this administration, and I say that because with respect to Asia, this particular candidate for president, Donald Trump, as a candidate, said more negative things about U.S. allies, and I'm not judging this, I'm just saying he said more negative things about U.S. allies than any candidate for president of either party in the modern history of the United States. I mean, he went to town on Japan in the campaign. Japan is one of our closest allies. So it was very unconventional, unusual relative to a candidate of either party. Even President Trump, now that he's president, is not going to dismantle the U.S.-Japan alliance, or the U.S.-ROK alliance, or the U.S.-Australia alliance, or the U.S.-Philippines alliance, and so on. So I think the United States is going to continue to have alliances in Asia. I think China is going to, and we should, China is going to continue to perceive that those alliances, directly or indirectly, are targeted against China. And they're entitled to feel what they feel and perceive what they perceive. The notion of kind of shared power is one that I don't know that I immediately buy into per se. But I think what we do need to do is understand each other's intentions, be honest about those intentions, and unideologically and in a clear-eyed way engage each other where engagement can be mutually beneficial. I don't know that that means, quote, sharing power. China is a non-aligned country, although it has a close partnership with North Korea. China is going to do what it feels is good for China. We're going to do what's good for us, and we should. And there are some areas where the two come together. North Korea is arguably one of those issues. And I think that's going to be the modus operandi for the foreseeable future as we go forward. And more broadly, I don't, notwithstanding some of the campaign rhetoric and other rhetoric, I don't sense that there has been a fundamental change in the U.S. government's viewpoint about the importance of Asia to the United States. Asia is, apart from Canada and Mexico, our North American neighbors and friends, the most important driver of U.S. prosperity and growth in the world. It will be for a long, long time to come. and we have to engage in Asia. We have to find a way to do that that works for America and that minimizes any opportunity for conflagration. And finally, I would just say, I think the one reason ultimately why the United States and China are not bound for war, going back to your initial premise of deterioration that you mentioned in terms of the book, I think we're not bound for war because, and very simply, we're both intercontinental nuclear weapon states. We're not going to go to war with China. It's just not going to happen. We may have very sharp disagreements on any number of issues, but we're living within the world of nuclear deterrence. And that alone means that a major conflagration between the U.S. and China, I think, is not in the cards, thankfully, in my judgment.
Back over here.
Speaking of North Korea, given the current administration's rhetoric and sanctions that have been worldwide, it appears that China doesn't want to maybe step up to actually imposing the sanctions that the U.S. wants. And when that spills over into trade talks, there's a lot of rhetoric about China's trade policies versus ours. Can you comment on the punishment that China might impose on U.S. businesses for the tough trade talk and the disagreements on North Korea, and how that might play out?
Yeah, those are great questions, and you're right to point to the interrelatedness of the two, because President Trump himself has said, on the record, interestingly, I'm paraphrasing very closely, if China helps us on North Korea, maybe I can look the other way on trade. He's actually said that publicly. And so there is an interlinkage in that regard. But on trade, my perception, let me make a couple of points. Number one thing that I think President Trump and candidate Donald Trump deserves a lot of credit for is I think he exposed a reality in the campaign as a candidate that had not been self-evident or obvious to many people, including in the mainstream of either party. Although arguably Bernie Sanders on the other side of the aisle also may have picked up on this to a lesser degree. And that is that what I think Trump understood as a candidate and understands as president, and I've talked about this for about a year, is that, first of all, China is not the entirety of the problem in terms of U.S. trade and the economy, but it is kind of the symbol of the problem. And so he understood that, he spoke about it that way, I would say essentially at a symbolic level. And what Trump understood is in a vast swath of this country, the U.S.-China relationship on trade had come to be politically unsustainable. Politically unsustainable. That the notion that China could run perennial surpluses of such magnitude with us and could, quote, steal jobs, et cetera, the language of Trump in the campaign, the fact that that was just not acceptable politically to a vast swath of this country was something that I think Trump, to his credit, picked up on before others did. And so I think the biggest challenge in the U.S.-China relationship, in the U.S.-China trade relationship, is how do you create a politically sustainable U.S.-China trade relationship from a U.S. vantage? And I would say, to his credit, President Trump, I think, has communicated that message to the Chinese. I perceive that the Chinese, and this is just a subjective perception, it's rooted in some conversations, but it's a perception. I think the Chinese now get it, that the lopsidedness of the relationship is not sustainable for America. It's not politically sustainable. And I think that China is now of a mindset, and these are my words, I'm reading this into what they're thinking, these are my words though. I think they sort of are saying, we had a pretty good run there for quite a while. We got a lot of intellectual property. We stole a lot of intellectual property. We did some things that were unfair. We didn't open our markets to the degree that the U.S. always has. We've run huge deficits for the U.S., surpluses for China. We need to stop while we're ahead. or slow down while we're ahead and start to address the issue of political sustainability. So I think, to your question, this is my perception. The Chinese, I think, are now in the frame of mind of how can we actually do a little bit more to make this relationship more viable for this president so that we can have a productive relationship with this president and with America. And that's why when President Trump went to China in November, the Chinese, and for that matter President Trump and others, noted that there were approximately $250 billion of trade deals signed as a, quote, deliverable from the president's visit. Obviously, it wasn't the president's doing, but it was packaged as a deliverable, and it's significant. And I think the Chinese understand they've got to do a better job. And I've said to the Chinese, the single thing you can do to start to change the narrative in the United States about China is treat the United States equitably relative to how the United States treats you as a trade partner. Because quite frankly, it's been a massively unbalanced trade relationship. And you need to open your markets to a much greater degree, give our best firms and sectors a chance to compete the way the U.S. has done for you. And if you start to treat the United States more fairly, you'll see a different narrative in the United States over time. And one other thing I would just say on this topic, and I'll briefly touch on North Korea, and sorry for being long-winded, but it's a rich topic. The Chinese have often said over the years that they are upset, I'm summarizing, they're upset that America doesn't treat China fairly. What I've said to the Chinese, my Chinese friends over the last year plus, is what you don't understand is a vast swath of the American people think you don't treat us fairly. And guess what? You don't. And that message has started to resonate. And to be honest, I give President Trump credit for focusing in on that message, and I think that's had a positive impact, not necessarily in a very perceptible way yet, but it's starting to change the terms of the debate. On North Korea, China sees North Korea through a very different lens than the United States does, for all the understandable reasons. And here's what I think. I think that even if China absolutely shut down everything with North Korea, this is my opinion, some would share it, others may disagree. But I think, frankly, increasingly some would share this view. Even if China just shut everything down, the fact is North Korea is going to pursue that program to the very bitter end. And I don't think there's anything China can do or the United States can do short of war to stop that. So the notion that China could turn off the faucet and shut down North Korea, in some ways it could do that and create a lot of hardship in North Korea, a lot of pain to people there, average people included, and above all average people, because the elites will take care of themselves. But it's not going to stop North Korea from pursuing and I think achieving its objective. And so my summary of this, and I could say more, but my summary of this is I think the United States and China have been absolutely wrong about North Korea in our respective assessments of the situation, but for exactly the opposite reasons. The U.S. has felt there's some amount of coercion that can bring China to the table, and I think we're wrong. And the Chinese have felt there's some amount of diplomacy or incentives that can bring North Korea to the table, and I think China is wrong. And it leaves a pretty unsatisfying picture. But the final thing I would just say, offering a thought on this, is North Korea becoming a nuclear weapons state with intercontinental reach is the worst thing that could possibly happen in the world, except for every alternative scenario, which are all worse. And that is why there haven't been any alternative scenarios. That is why we haven't gone to war. Because the generals, forget me, I'm not a great expert, the generals have said the war would cost many hundreds of thousands and deep into the millions dead to stop this. And you get to a point where the solution becomes worse than the problem. So that's a big one that's still out there, and I think it's a very unsatisfying picture from an American or Chinese or world standpoint, but I think that's where we are.
We have a student question back here.
真的很荣幸听您的演讲，谢谢。So there's a growing population of Chinese students studying abroad in the United States, and that number is still growing rapidly every year. So I'm just wondering, what's your opinion in how this population might affect the U.S. narrative on China and how it might affect the U.S.-China relationship? Thank you.
That's a great question. And first of all, I think that the fact that we have so many students from China in the United States benefits the United States greatly. I think it benefits China in different ways as well. I certainly hope we continue to see the kind of robust engagement at the student-to-student level in both directions. And I think the Chinese students who are here, of which there are hundreds of thousands in this country right now and millions over years, including alumni and folks who are now working, green card holders, American citizens, and so on, I think those students are uniquely positioned to play a very important bridging role in the communications between the United States and China. Because a lot of communication is kind of lost in proverbial translation. But when Chinese students come from China, study in this country, go to football games on Saturdays, spend time with American students, internalize American culture, understand the contours of the policy debates and the academic debates and U.S. academic culture, to be able to take that back and help Chinese better understand the reality of American life and the complexity and texture of American life, I think is an enormously valuable thing. I think that too often what happens, and particularly historically, and I sense that it continues to happen today, and I was a U.S. student in China when I was a junior in college, and I've looked at this issue for a long time. One of the things that Chinese students in the United States do not do as well as American students in China, for a variety of reasons, is really immerse themselves in the culture. And too often, and you may know this, and I see some heads nodding, too often Chinese students are hanging around with Chinese students, speaking Chinese on WeChat, texting each other in Chinese, celebrating the Chinese holidays, understandably, Chinese New Year, and they're not allowing themselves to get as deeply immersed and enmeshed in U.S. society and culture as American students very typically do when they're in China. And that's been a long-standing phenomenon, and I hope to see that improve in a sense, because it's good for the students, it's good for this country, and it's good for the cross-cultural bridging. But I think that cross-cultural bridging role is very important. And I also think providing an honest and authentic Chinese perspective in the classroom, and I guess I would say an individual perspective that's true to who you are as a student, that tells your truth, will help American students better understand the textured reality of China in ways that many don't. So I think Chinese students in this country are great ambassadors in a couple of different directions. I absolutely also think American students going to China can and should and do play the same role, and I think we need more of both.
Question back here, and then the last question, I'm going to come back for that side of the room, but we need to keep both questions and answers shorter.
Okay.
You spoke of China more overtly offering itself as a model to parts of the world that are perhaps less developed today. I'm guessing that Africa may be the primary spot, but I'm curious your response to that and what the consequences of it are, Africa and what other parts of the world perhaps.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you're right. I think China is holding itself up as a model for mostly the developing world, mostly in Africa, Latin America, to some degree Central Asia, and perhaps South Asia. And I think what China is basically saying is, we've been there. We've been a developing country. We are in some ways still a developing country, although also very wealthy and developed in certain pockets. We can help you navigate the development issues because we've had success with it, and we've had success with it with our model. And so the Chinese are saying to others, here's what we've done. We've had 30 plus years of 10% plus growth a year, something never achieved in all of human economic history by any country at any time for that length of time. And we did it by using the following tools from our toolkit. You might find those tools useful for yourself. It's Africa, it's Latin America, it's very much Central Asia in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very important policy priority of the Chinese leadership and Xi Jinping personally. And that's the message that China is now very explicitly putting out there to the world. And I think nations and their leaderships will look at the models that are out there and make a decision based on what they judge is best for them.
Last question.
On the same line of thought, what is your opinion of the role of India and maybe Vietnam in mitigating the influence of China in the South China Sea?
It's a great question. Let me say a couple of different things. On India, you raise a very good point. One of the new formulations rhetorically of the Trump administration is to refer to the Asia-Pacific region as what he calls the Indo-Pacific. And he didn't coin the term, but he as president is, I think, the first to use that in a sustained way. So President Trump refers to the Indo-Pacific rather than the former term, the Asia-Pacific. And by doing that, I believe that the Trump administration is trying to signal that we want to engage India and that we see India, I think, implicitly as a potential counterbalance to China in this broad region. That being said, I think there are some limitations to that framing because India, while a very significant player in South Asia, is not really a significant player in East Asia per se. It's an Indian Ocean power. It's not really a Pacific power. That being said, I do think that the Trump administration is thinking about India as an important partner and potential, although it doesn't say it this way, rhetorical and possibly substantive counterbalance or counterweight to China. What role India might play in the South China Sea, I think, is a different question, and I think it's probably not a very significant role. But Vietnam very much is in the mix, and I think U.S. relations with Vietnam have become much stronger in recent years. I think there is a real friendship between our countries. It's certainly not an alliance. Our systems are different, but frankly, there's a very high level of pro-American sentiment in Vietnam. I think there's a broad, very positive vibe in this country toward Vietnam today. And I think that the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is going to continue to develop very much with the notion of the South China Sea dispute in mind. Vietnam and the Philippines have really been the two principal counterpoints to China in the South China Sea context. There are other claimants, but it's mainly Vietnam and the Philippines. Philippines is now moving in a very different direction under President Duterte. But Vietnam, I think, senses, and I think we sense, that we have some kindredness of spirit around a number of issues, including the South China Sea. So I think Vietnam's role is going to be important, but it's not an ally. It's out there on its own, but I think we tend to be sympathetic to the fact that it's in a pretty rough neighborhood when it comes to the South China Sea. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.